The papers were in Temperance's hand before the musicians had finished the second measure of the quadrille, and it was the sight of them, not the woman on her husband's arm, that stopped the room. She had carried them folded in her glove for 3 days, waiting for a moment she had not truly believed would come, and here it was, Julian Ashford, Duke of Marrow. Walking into his own ballroom with a stranger's fingers curled possessively at his sleeve, a stranger in ice-blue silk who leaned close to his ear and laughed as though she owned the right to. Temperance did not yet know what the laugh would cost her, and him, and a woman she had never met. Had she known, she would have opened her hand all the same. She was 26, plainly dressed in a duchess's own house, and she had built a whole marriage, such as it was, on the discipline of not flinching. She did not flinch now. Candlelight rode along the ballroom's gilt cornices and slid off 200 watching faces, and every one of those faces turned, in the space of a held breath, from the Duke's companion to his wife. Somewhere behind her fan, Lady Sybil Quince murmured something delicious to her neighbor. Somewhere near the doors, a footman set down a tray too hard. The musicians, sensing something the dancers had not yet named, let the measure falter and die a bar early, and into that unfinished silence the whole room seemed to lean forward at once, the way a crowd leans toward a carriage accident it is a shame to want to see. Julian stopped mid-step, his gaze finding Temperance's across the floor, and whatever he saw in her face made the color leave his own. "Temperance," he began. She lifted the papers instead of an answer, held them so the candlelight caught the seal, and let her voice carry the length of the room, low and even, the way she read figures aloud from a ledger that would not balance. "You need not trouble yourself with introductions, Your Grace," she said. "I have brought something of my own to present tonight." In 11 days, the trustees appointed under the old Duke's will would gather in this house to certify that the marriage had stood a full 12-month without scandal attached to the Marrow name, and that the estate and the guardianship of a certain absent minor remained where the will intended it. Temperance had read that clause herself in her husband's own strongbox on a wet Tuesday in March, in the particular ledger hand of a solicitor who signed himself A. Fen. She had not understood then why the clause made her uneasy in a way no other clause did. She understood a great deal more now, watching the woman in ice-blue silk take her hand from Julian's sleeve as though it had suddenly burned her. The woman was young, younger than Temperance had first thought, seen up close, with a soft, frightened mouth utterly unsuited to the role she seemed to be playing, and hands that would not keep still at her sides, as though she had been told precisely where to stand, and not at all what to do once she got there. Julian had gone very still, the stillness of a man taking a blow without letting his face report it, and Temperance had been married to that stillness long enough to know it meant something was being decided behind his eyes that he had not decided in front of her. "You will want to explain this in private," he said. "I had rather thought," said Temperance, "that you might have explained it to me in private a great while before you brought her into my ballroom." A ripple went through the guests nearest them, the particular hush of 200 people pretending not to listen with their whole bodies. She held the papers out, not thrusting them, simply offering, the way she might have offered a debt long overdue. "These are the articles that would end our arrangement, drawn a fortnight past, and signed only by myself, waiting on your hand beside mine. I had hoped never to need them witnessed. I find I no longer mind if they are." Somewhere in the crowd a glass rang against a tray and did not break. Julian did not take the papers. He looked at them the way a man looks at a debt he recognizes, but cannot yet pay. And then he looked past her. To the doors, to Mrs. Pruitt standing rigid at the edge of the room, with her hands knotted in her apron, and something moved through his face that Temperance, who had spent a year learning to read it, did not recognize at all. "Not here," he said, and for the first time that evening his voice was not steady. Whatever you believe you have seen tonight, not here, in front of them. They have already seen it, Temperance said. I am only telling them what it means. She did not know, as she said it, how wrong she was about what it meant, nor how right she was to have said it aloud at last, in the light, before witnesses, exactly as the old habit of her whole overlooked life had never once permitted her to do. They did not speak again until the last carriage had rattled off the drive, and the house had gone the particular kind of quiet that follows a scandal, thick and listening. Temperance found him in the library with the papers, unsigned, spread before him on the desk like a hand of cards he had not yet decided how to play. You will tell me who she is, she said, or you will sign those, and we need never trouble each other with the truth of anything again. She is no one you need fear. I do not fear her. I fear what I am apparently married to. Julian's mouth tightened. You knew what this marriage was when you agreed to it. I knew what it was not, Temperance said. It was not meant to include you meeting a woman by night and lying to me about your errands, and it was certainly not meant to include her arriving on your arm at my own ball in a gown I would wager costs more than my brother's schooling for a year. That landed. She saw it land. A year ago, in this same library, they had struck the whole bargain across this same desk, plainly, and without either of them pretending to a tenderness neither felt. His grandmother's will had required a wife within 12 months of his inheriting, or the guardianship of his young ward would pass to his cousin by marriage, a solicitor of excellent reputation and empty pockets named Aldis Fen. Temperance's father had died owing sums that would have put her small brother into a counting house before he was breached, the same sums she had spent her girlhood trying to keep straight in his own failing ledgers, the one inheritance he left her that was not debt, and a duchess's settlement had solved the rest of that arithmetic entirely. We shall live as partners in an enterprise, Julian had said then, and expect nothing further of one another. I have kept accounts more complicated than that, she had answered, and I am not afraid of an honest bargain. They had shaken hands on it, absurdly, like men closing a sale of horses, and she had thought, privately, that a bargain honestly kept might in time become something else, though she had not said so, then or since. Now, she said, I have kept my side of it. I have run this house, and balanced its books to the farthing, and asked nothing of you that was not written down. I am asking now. There are things I cannot yet lay before you, Julian said, not because I do not trust you, because the laying of them would cost someone else more than it would cost me. Someone else has already cost me a great deal, standing in my ballroom in ice blue silk. A knock interrupted them, brisk and unapologetic, and Mrs. Pruitt let herself in without waiting for leave, a tea tray in her hands and an expression that had buried 2 husbands and outlasted 3 duchesses of the house before this one. I'll not pretend I wasn't listening at the door, she said, setting the tray down with a clatter, on account of I was. And someone in this house had better start speaking sense before the pair of you set the whole county talking worse than it's talking already. Mrs. Pruitt, Julian began. Don't Mrs. Pruitt me, Your Grace, I changed your linen when you were in short coats, she poured with the brisk economy of 30 years' service. Your Grace the Second, she said to Temperance, not unkindly. You've a right to know what you're owed, and I'll say only this much, since it is not mine to say the rest. Whatever his lordship is hiding, it is not another woman warming his bed. I have kept this house 40 years, and I know the smell of that particular lie, and this is not it. Then, what is it the smell of? Temperance asked. Mrs. Pruitt's mouth pressed thin. Grief, mostly, she said, and a debt he thinks is his alone to pay. She left them with the tea going cold and the papers still unsigned between them, and Julian did not look at his wife again that night. though she noticed, before she went up, that his hand had moved to cover the papers as though to keep them from the draft, and had stayed there a long while after there was any draft to keep them from. Mr. Aldis Fen called at Marrow House 3 mornings later, as he had called every quarter day for the whole of Temperance's marriage, ledgers under his arm and spectacles catching the light so that his eyes were never quite visible when he wished them not to be. He was a neat man, precise in his dress, gentle in his voice, the sort who apologized before he interrupted and thanked you before he contradicted you, and Temperance had never once in a year of quarter days seen him raise that voice. He did not raise it now. "I had hoped, Your Grace, that the unpleasantness at the ball might resolve itself quietly," he said, laying his papers before her with the care of a man laying out a hand of cards he already knows will win. "For the sake of the estate. For the sake, if I may say so, of a certain codicil that concerns a fortnight hence." "You may say so," Temperance said. "You drafted it. I had that honor." He straightened his cuffs, a small, precise gesture he made, she had noticed, whenever he was about to say something he did not entirely believe. "The trustees will want the marriage's good standing beyond question when they meet. Talk of this kind, once loosed among 200 guests, is difficult to call back. Then perhaps you might tell me who she is, Mr. Fen, since my husband will not." Something crossed his face too quickly to name, gone before she could be certain she had seen it. "I could not say, Your Grace. I keep his lordship's accounts, not his confidences. You keep a great many things, by your own account." She had said it lightly, testing, and watched it land somewhere she had not expected. His hand went still on the ledger's edge. "I keep this house solvent," he said, "which is more than can be said, if I am honest, for the numbers his lordship's own steward brought me last quarter. There are sums unaccounted, Your Grace. I had not meant to trouble you with it before the trustees' meeting, but since we are being frank with one another." He opened the ledger to a page marked with a torn corner, a column of figures with one entry blotted as though a hand less careful than his own had tried to correct it and thought better. £400, dispersed in quarterly sums, to no name I can find recorded anywhere else in this house. "I had assumed, forgive me, that Your Grace might know something of it, since you keep the household books so admirably yourself." Temperance looked at the blotted entry a long moment. "I do not," she said, "but I intend to." "Of course." He closed the ledger with the softness of a man closing a door he wanted her to think was already shut. "Take your time, Your Grace. There is, after all, so very little of it left." He bowed himself out with perfect courtesy, and by that evening the story had already reached White's, where a wagering book had been opened on whether the Duchess of Marrow would sue for separation before the quarter was out, and by the next morning Lady Sybil Quince had called on no fewer than 6 houses to say, with real sorrow in her voice and none at all in her eyes, that she had always thought there was something not quite right in a marriage begun so coldly. And had anyone considered how convenient it was for a poor young woman to have married into 40,000 a year? Temperance heard the story secondhand from her own maid before noon, and by the time the second post arrived there were 3 separate cards of condolence left at the door by women who had never once called on her in a 12-month of quiet marriage. Each of them worded with such tender regret that she understood, reading them, exactly how much pleasure regret of that particular kind could give. She sat a long while afterward with the blotted ledger page open before her, tracing the torn corner with one finger, thinking that whoever had torn it in haste, and that haste, in a man as careful as Aldis Fen, was itself a kind of confession, if only she could learn to read it. She brought the ledgers to Julian herself that night, refusing the excuse of a servant, and found him in the estate office with his coat off and his sleeves turned back, going through his father's old accounts by a single branch of candles, and something in the set of his shoulders told her he had been at it since Fen's carriage left the drive. "You found it too," she said, setting her copy beside his. 400 a year, unaccounted. 411, Julian said, in the years before my father died, and 100 more since, though the sums since are mine to have given, and I do not call them unaccounted. Then account for them to me. He was quiet long enough that she thought he would refuse her again, and instead he pulled a chair beside his own and set it down with a decisiveness that surprised her, and said, "Sit, and I will show you what I can. And you will have to trust me for the rest a little longer." They worked past midnight, side by side, his father's crabbed hand and Fen's careful one, and her own quick sums crossing 3 generations of the estate's business, and somewhere in the second hour she caught him watching her total a column faster than he could follow it, and correct an error in his father's own arithmetic, without pausing to check her work twice. "You do that the way other women embroider," he said. "Badly, and for want of anything better to do with my hands?" "No," he said, and there was something in his voice she had not heard from him before, something almost light, as though it were the one language you have never had to translate for anyone. "It is the only language that never lied to me," she said. "Figures do not flatter, and they do not scheme. If a column will not balance, it is because something is missing, not because someone wishes you to feel a fool for asking. I begin to think you and Mrs. Pruitt would get on very well discussing my failings. We already do, Your Grace. Tuesdays, over the mending." He laughed at that, a real laugh, startled out of him, brief and low and entirely unguarded, the first she had heard from him in the whole length of their acquaintance, and it changed his face so thoroughly that she found herself staring before she recalled her manners and looked back at the ledger. He sobered almost as quickly, as though the laugh itself had reminded him of something he could not afford to forget. "There is a woman," he said quietly into the candlelight, "who has some claim on my father's conscience, and therefore on mine. I have supported her a long while, quietly, because to do otherwise would cost her more than it would ever cost me, and because my mother's memory is bound up in the silence in ways I am not yet free to explain. That is the whole of what I can give you tonight." "Is she the woman from the ball?" "Yes. Is she your mistress?" "No," he said, and met her eyes without flinching the way he had not managed to, she realized, since the ball. "I give you my word on that, though I know a word is a poor coin to offer after what you saw." "It is not nothing," Temperance said, surprising herself. "I do not ask you to trust me with the rest tonight," Julian said. "I ask only that you wait." She did not answer that she would, only that she returned to the ledger and let her silence stand as something less than refusal, and later, climbing the stairs alone, she found she was turning his laugh over in her mind the way she turned a column that would not balance. Certain there was something in it she had not yet found the sum of. The blow came 5 days later, on the morning the county paper printed, under a small unsigned notice, that the Duke of Merrow's steward had laid certain accounts before the trustees showing considerable sums paid these 3 years to an unnamed woman of the town, and that the Duchess herself was known to have uncovered the discrepancy in her own hand. Temperance read it standing in the breakfast room with her tea going cold, and understood, with a slow and sickening clarity, that the very column of figures she had traced by candlelight with Julian at her side had been copied from her own ledger, in her own recognizable notation, and delivered to a newspaperman as proof not of a mystery, but of a confession. "He had my book," she said, when Julian found her there. "My own working papers. I left them in the estate office not 4 days past. Fen had no business touching your papers. Fen had every business touching them, since I gave you no reason to lock the office and every reason to trust the man who has kept your books since, before you could write your own name." Her voice was not raised. It had gone instead very flat and very careful, the voice she used when a column would not balance, and she suspected, finally, why you told me to wait. I waited. And in the waiting, my own honest work has been turned into a weapon, and every soul from here to the county assembly now believes I dug up your infidelity myself and am too proud to leave you over it. That is not what happened. I do not know what happened, Julian, because you will not tell me, and a woman cannot defend a truth she has not been given. He crossed the room and took her hands before she could step back, an act so unlike the whole careful distance of their year together that she went still with the shock of it. I will tell you this much more, he said. The woman is no stranger to me, and the sums are no theft, and if you will trust me 11 days further, until the trustees meet, I will lay the whole of it before you, and before them together, in the light where it cannot be twisted again. And if I cannot wait 11 days, if Lady Sybil Quince has already called on my own brother's schoolmaster to ask whether the boys' fees have always been paid so promptly, and to wonder aloud what a woman married for convenience might do to protect an income she depends on? His face went white at that, whiter than she had seen it since the ball. She would not. She has. This is what your silence has cost me, while you protect a woman whose name I do not even know. I am protecting her because no one else ever has, Julian said, and for the first time his composure cracked entirely, his voice rough with something that was not anger, though anger would have been easier to answer. I have watched what happens to women who are exposed before they are ready. Temperance, I will not do that to her, not even to save my own name, and not even, he said quieter, to save this bargain of ours, whatever it has become. Then I hope she is worth what it is costing the rest of us, Temperance said, and left him standing in the breakfast room with her tea cooling between them, and did not see, because she had already turned away, how long he stood there afterward, with his hand pressed flat against the table, as a man braces himself against a blow he has decided he will not return. Fen came to her 3 days after that, alone, without his ledgers, which she had learned by now to read as its own kind of warning. He found her in the small parlor she had claimed as her own since the marriage, mending linen with Mrs. Pruitt's basket at her feet, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and an expression of such careful sympathy that she distrusted it before he had said a word. "I will not keep you long, Your Grace," he said. "I come only as a friend to this house and to you, who have been used very ill in all this." "You are kind to say so. I mean it plainly. A woman in your position, married for practical reasons, with a brother's welfare depending on the settlement, and no true affection to lose, need not ruin herself over a husband's private failings. The trustees will meet in 8 days. If the marriage were to end quietly before then, by mutual and private agreement, I could see to it that your settlement was paid in full, your brother's schooling secured for its whole term, and no word of scandal need follow you beyond this county. I have influence enough with the trustees to arrange it discreetly. No one need know more than that a bargain, honestly entered, was honestly dissolved, and the estate would pass to trustee administration under the codicil since the marriage failed within its first year. The estate's business need not concern you at all once you are provided for." Temperance set down her needle. "You have thought this through with great care, Miss Fen. I have thought of little else but your Grace's comfort. I do not think that is true," she said, and watched his hand move, precise and unhurried, to straighten his cuffs, the small gesture she had learned by now to read as the sound of a lie settling into place. "I think you have thought a great deal about the codicil, and very little about my comfort, and I think you would be glad to see me gone from this house by any door at all, so long as I go before the trustees meet. You mistake me. Perhaps, but I will not take your bargain. all the same. It cost her more than she let her face show. £400 a year and her brother's schooling secured beyond any doubt were not sums she could afford to refuse lightly. Not with her own settlement uncertain and her husband's affections, such as they might ever have been, still unproven to her. I married for practical reasons, as you say, and I have kept every practical promise I made. I find I am not willing to break the one promise I did not put in writing, which was to see the truth of this house through to its end before I judged it. Fen's mouth thinned, the sympathy gone from it entirely, replaced for one unguarded moment by something colder that he mastered again almost at once. That is a costly kind of honesty, Your Grace. I have always found it so, Temperance said. I have simply never yet found it costlier than the alternative. He bowed and took his leave, and Mrs. Pruitt, who had said nothing throughout and mended a full seam in the silence after the door closed, remarked only, "That man polishes his spectacles the way some men load a pistol, Your Grace, careful and quick and never quite looking at what he's aiming for." And Temperance, turning that over long after the light had gone from the window, thought that Mrs. Pruitt, as usual, had said in one sentence what it would take the rest of them a fortnight to prove. The dismissal came from Julian himself, and that was the cruelest part of it. He told her 2 mornings later that he had arranged for her to remove to her aunt's house in the country until the trustees' meeting was passed, that the talk in town had grown too sharp for her comfort, and that a carriage would be ready within the hour. "You are sending me away. I am protecting you from what is coming. You are deciding, alone, what I am strong enough to bear, exactly as you have done since the night of the ball, and calling it protection because the word is kinder than the truth." "Temperance," he began. "No, you will hear this, since I am apparently to be sent off before I may say it in your house again." She stood very straight. The way she had learned to stand through every humiliation of a poor relation's life before this marriage had given her a roof to stand under. "I did not marry you for love, and you did not marry me for it, and I have never once asked you to supply what was not in our bargain. But I have kept my side of every article in it, in the light, where anyone might have looked, and you have kept yours in the dark, and now you would send me away rather than let me stand beside you while the dark comes due. That is not protection, Julian. That is the same fear that sent whatever woman you are shielding away from this family in the first place, and I begin to wonder if you learned it from the same hand that taught her to be afraid." He went very white and said nothing, and she took his silence for the answer it was, and went up to see her trunks packed with her own hands rather than let a maid see how her hands shook. She was still in her room, an hour later, coat half-buttoned, when Mrs. Pruitt came without knocking and pressed a folded note into her hand, sealed with no crest, in a hand that was young and unpracticed and clearly frightened. "It had come," Mrs. Pruitt said, "by a boy who would not give his name, sent from a cottage 2 miles past the home wood, where a woman calling herself Mrs. Wren had lived quietly these 3 years with a sickly child, and no husband anyone had ever seen." Temperance broke the seal with fingers that had gone very still. The note was short and badly spelled, and said only that the writer had been made to say things at the ball that were not true, that she was sorry, that she had been told her son's parish schooling and her cottage both depended on her silence, and that she could not carry the lie any further, now that a gentleman's clerk had come to her that very morning asking questions about payments that were never hers to explain. It was signed simply Wren, and beneath the signature, in a hand grown suddenly firmer, 1 line more, "He is not what they are saying, and neither, madam, are you." Temperance stood a long while with the note in her hand, the carriage waiting below, her trunks packed for a country exile she no longer intended to take, and asked herself the one question she could not yet answer and did not dare send downstairs to ask aloud, if this woman was no mistress but something else entirely, or someone else's shame kept silent this long out of a fear she recognized in her own bones, then who, precisely, had sent a clerk to frighten her into silence again on the very morning Temperance was meant to be safely out of the county? She did not take the carriage. She went instead, with Mrs. Pruitt beside her and the note folded inside her glove, to the cottage past the home wood, and found there a woman perhaps 3 years her junior, thin and worn and startlingly like Julian about the eyes, nursing a boy of 2 who coughed in his sleep. It took less than an hour, over tea neither of them touched, for the whole of it to come plain, that Wren was the old Duke's daughter by a woman he had never married, sent away in disgrace before Julian was of an age to prevent it, and that Julian, on his father's deathbed, had sworn to provide for her in secret, because their mother, dying slowly of her own grief and pride, could not bear the name spoken in her house. And Julian, out of a mercy that had curdled into secrecy, had kept that oath to the letter and broken it in every particular a wife might reasonably expect from a husband. "He comes by night because I asked it," Wren said. "Not for shame of me, for shame of what his mother's memory would suffer if the county knew, and she barely 8 months in her grave." "I did not know, madam, until Mr. Fen's clerk began asking after the payments that anyone meant to make a weapon of it." "Fen's clerk," Temperance said. Young man, spectacled, wrote everything down twice as though he did not trust his own hand. Mrs. Pruitt, listening, made a small sound of recognition. "Simpkins," she said, "comes to the kitchen door for beer most Fridays, and has done since he was prenticed to Fen 5 years back, frightened of his own shadow, that one, and twice as frightened of his master." "Then we will need Simpkins," Temperance said, "and we will need it in 8 days, before the trustees, not after." What followed was less a plan than a proof assembled the way she assembled a ledger, one entry at a time, checked against its neighbor until the whole column stood true, Wren's note kept safe and copied twice, the old Duke's letter, which Wren had guarded 3 years in a tin box under her floor, acknowledging her as his daughter and charging his son to provide for her without ever naming her to the world. The torn ledger page from Fen's own book, which Temperance had kept rather than return, and Simpkins, found trembling at the kitchen door on the Friday appointed, who admitted over 2 pints of Mrs. Pruitt's dark ale and a kindness he plainly had not expected from a duchess, that he kept a second book of his master's true accounts in his own hand, because Mr. Fen had once told him a clerk who could prove nothing was a clerk who could be blamed for everything, and Simpkins had decided, quietly, some months back, that he would rather have the proof than the trust. Julian told the whole of it that same evening in the estate office, said very little for a long while, and then said, "I should have laid it before you the first night, and let you decide with me how it was to be handled, rather than deciding alone what you could bear." "You should have," Temperance agreed. "But you have said it now, before the meeting, rather than after, and that is the whole of what I asked for." She sent word to Justice Harlan Price, the trustee whose honesty even Fen had never dared to question, that the meeting in 5 days would want a fuller accounting than any yet given, and spent the days between counting them aloud the way she had once counted the days until her brother's fees fell due, 4, then 3, then 2, marking each on the estate calendar in her own small hand as though the counting itself might hold the household steady. Fen, informed of nothing but sensing, as careful men do, a change in the weather, called twice that week to inquire after the Duchess's health with a solicitude so precise it had, for the first time in a year of quarter days, the faint, unsteady edge of a man polishing his spectacles too often to see clearly through them. The trustees met in the long drawing room on the appointed morning, 5 men in dark coats at a table set with the estate's ledgers going back 3 generations, and Temperance had made certain, through no request that could be traced to her hand, that the room held more witnesses than the 5. Mrs. Pruitt by the door with her arms folded, Lady Sybil Quince arrived uninvited on the strength of gossip alone, and too curious to leave once she understood what she had walked into. And Wren, veiled and trembling but present, seated at Temperance's own insistence in a chair by the window where the morning light fell full upon her face. Beyond the tall windows, a blackbird went on with its ordinary business in the yew hedge, indifferent to what the room decided, and somewhere below a cartwheel creaked twice and was still, the whole indifferent morning going on outside the glass exactly as it had the day before. Fen sat at the table's foot with his ledgers before him, composed, precise, his spectacles catching the light exactly as they had the morning he first laid his blotted page before her. "Your Grace," he said, when Justice Price called the meeting to order, "I regret that so private a matter must be aired before so many, but the trustees will recall that it was I who first brought these discrepancies forward, out of duty to the estate, and I who warned that the marriage's good standing was already in doubt before ever these ladies chose to make a public spectacle of it." "You did bring them forward, Mr. Fen," Temperance said. "I wonder if you might tell the trustees precisely whose hand copied the figures that appeared afterward in the county paper." A small stillness. "I could not say. Newspapers have their own sources, Your Grace, and I am not in the habit of. The figures were mine," Temperance said, "in my own notation, which I have kept in this house a full year and shown to no one outside it save my husband, and once, briefly, left unlocked in the estate office on the same afternoon your clerk was seen leaving that office by the garden door." Justice Price's gaze moved, slow and deliberate, to the pale young man seated at the table's far end, who had not yet been asked to speak and had gone, in the space of that single sentence, the color of old parchment. "Mr. Simpkins," Price said, "is there something you wish to tell this room?" Simpkins looked at his master, and Fen did not look back at him at all, which Temperance thought, watching, was itself its own small answer. "I kept a second book," Simpkins said, and his voice cracked on the first word and steadied on the rest, the way ice steadies once the first true fracture has already run its length. "My own hand, Your Grace." Of the sums Mr. Fen drew from the estate these 10 years past under names that were never real names, and the sums he told me to copy from her ladyship's own working papers and carry to a newspaperman, and he told me it was for the good of the house, and I believed him a long while, because he is a clever man and I am not, but I could not sleep of nights any longer for the believing. He set a slim black book upon the table, worn soft at the corners from handling, and Justice Price opened it without a word and read in silence for the length of several held breaths while the room around him held its own. £4,000, Price said at last, "over 10 years, Mr. Fen, entered here against no name but your own initials." Fen's composure did not break so much as it thinned, a fine crack spreading through porcelain rather than a shattering. "I have served this family 30 years, he said, and for the first time his gentle voice had an edge under it, old and raw. "I watched the old Duke pass over me for every honor a man of my ability might have earned elsewhere twice over, because I had not the right name for it, and I watched his son inherit 40,000 a year for the accident of his birth, while I kept the books that made that fortune possible and was thanked, each quarter, with a fee that would not clothe his footman. I did not steal what I was owed. I collected what was never paid. You collected it," Justice Price said, "by forging entries, corrupting a clerk, and attempting to destroy a marriage and a woman's reputation to conceal the theft before this meeting could examine it. That is not a grievance, Miss Fen. That is a crime, and this room has the proof of it in your own clerk's hand and your own initials both." Wren, at the window, drew back her veil at last, quietly, and said, in a voice that shook only a little. "And in mine, sir, since it was my silence you tried to buy with threats against my son's schooling, the very week I learned the truth of what my father's payments to me had become in your hands." A murmur went through the room at that, Lady Sybil Quince's fan going still in her fingers for perhaps the first time that season, and Fen, faced at last with the whole shape of what had been assembled against him, did something Temperance had not expected. His hands, so precise through every quarter day of the last year, began at last to shake, and he pressed them flat upon the table as though to still them, and said, "Lo." To no one in particular, I only ever wanted to be owed what I was owed, and in the saying of it, stripped for once of every careful gesture, he looked for the first time like an old man who had spent 30 years counting a debt no one else had ever agreed was real, and Temperance found, to her own surprise, that the anger she had carried a fortnight had gone somewhere quiet and left pity in its place. "The estate will not prosecute," she said, before the trustees could speak, and saw Julian's head turn to her in surprise that was not displeasure. "Mr. Fen will resign every office he holds in this house today, restore what can be restored from what remains of 10 years' collection, and remove to whatever quiet corner of the kingdom will have him on an allowance sufficient to keep him from want, and insufficient to keep him from remembering why he needed it. That is mercy enough for a man who tried to ruin 2 women to settle an old account. It is more, I think, than he offered either of us." Justice Price looked to Julian, who nodded once, and to the eldest of the other trustees, who studied Temperance for a long moment, as though reassessing a sum he had carried wrongly for a year, and then looked to Fen himself, who said nothing further, only bowed his head over his own ruined ledger, the way a man bows over a grave he has dug for himself, and finds, too late, too narrow for the pride he meant to bury in it. The trustees, after some brief and satisfied murmuring among themselves, pronounced the marriages standing beyond question and the codicil's danger past, and it was Julian, not Temperance, who crossed the room then and knelt by Wren's chair and said, "Before every witness present, this is my sister. Our father's daughter, and mine too have claimed openly a great deal sooner than I found the courage for, and the silence that followed that was not the silence of scandal, but of something else entirely, the particular hush of a room recalculating, all at once, exactly what it thought it knew. It was 3 days later, the trustees gone, the county paper printing a retraction so small it might have been mistaken for an advertisement, that Julian found Temperance in the estate office among the ledgers, and did not sit beside her this time, but stood, turning his hat in his hands like a man who had rehearsed a speech and abandoned it somewhere on the stairs. "I owe you the whole of an apology I do not know how to make in one sitting," he said, "so I will make you an offer instead, and you may refuse it as freely as you refused Fen's, since I find I would rather be refused honestly than accepted for the wrong reason. Go on." "Marry me again," he said, "though we are already married, in whatever way a man may ask a woman to choose him a second time, when the first time was only ever a bargain, not for the codicil, which is settled, and not for your brother's schooling, which I will secure whether you ever speak to me again or not. Marry me, because you wish it. It is the only reason I will take." Temperance set down her pen. "You once told me you did not ask me to trust you. You asked only that I wait." "I remember. I am done waiting, Julian, but I find I am not done choosing, and I choose to tell you that I have loved you since somewhere around the 2nd hour we spent over your father's crooked arithmetic, though I did not have a word for it until I watched you kneel by your sister's chair in front of 5 trustees and a woman who has never in her life failed to gossip." He crossed the room and took her hands, as he had once before in a very different breakfast room, and this time she did not go still with shock, but let her fingers close around his. They were married again, in the small sense that matters more than any large one, on a quiet morning a fortnight later, in the chapel at Marrow, with no guests but Mrs. Pruitt weeping unashamedly into a handkerchief she had embroidered for the occasion, Wren seated in the front pew with her boy asleep against her shoulder, and Justice Price standing witness beside a chastened Lady Sybil Quince, who had called the week prior to apologize in person and been asked, gently, to stand as friend rather than rival, an offer she accepted with more grace than anyone had thought her capable of showing. The ledger of that autumn settled itself, in time, as ledgers do. Aldis Fen removed to a cottage on the Welsh coast, his allowance paid quarterly by a solicitor who was not Julian and need never speak his name aloud again, and was heard from only once more in a letter to Simpkins thanking him, stiffly, for a kindness he said he had not earned and would try, in what years remained him, to deserve. Simpkins was made steward in his master's place, at double his old wage and half his old fear, and kept, ever after, only one book. Wren and her son removed to a house of their own within sight of Marrow's chimneys, welcomed at last to every table she had once watched from a cottage window, her father's old letter framed now above her own hearth, where any caller might read it who cared to, since there was no longer any shame left in the house for the reading to uncover. Lady Sybil Quince, true to the friendship she had been offered rather than the rivalry she had once preferred, stood godmother the following spring to a child not her own, and discovered, to her own visible surprise, that she liked the office better than she had ever liked being envied. And it was Wren's boy's laugh, high and unguarded, that Temperance thought of most a year later, standing once more at the top of the ballroom stairs on the anniversary of the night everything had nearly broken. Watching her husband cross the same floor toward her, no stranger on his arm this time. Only his sister on one side and his nephew's small hand in the other, the whole room's attention following him exactly as it had a year before, save that this time every face that turned toward something whole. "You are staring, Your Grace," Julian said, low, for her ear only. When he reached her, "I am remembering," Temperance said, "what I told you the last time you walked toward me across this room, that I need not trouble myself with introductions, that I had brought something of my own to present." She had. This time, she drew from her glove not papers, but a single folded page, the last entry in her private ledger, closed out and balanced, every debt of that terrible year paid or forgiven, and handed it to him instead of a summons, and watched him read it and laugh, the same unguarded laugh she had first startled out of him over his father's crooked arithmetic, and thought that a woman who had spent her whole life overlooked might, after all, be the one person in any room built to notice exactly what mattered, and know precisely when, at last, to say so aloud. If this story warmed you, the way a woman's own careful honesty turned out to be the one ledger no one could falsify, then stay a while longer by this fire with me. There is a chair kept for you here, and a kettle always just off the boil, and I would love nothing more than to hear, in the comments below, which moment stayed with you longest, the papers in the ballroom, or the letter that finally balanced. If you have not already, keep your place by the hearth and subscribe, so we may tell the next one together. Until then, be gentle with the ones who are still waiting to be noticed, and sleep well, knowing that some ledgers, however long overdue, do balance in the end.